For thousands of years, the greatest enemy of human survival was not war, not famine, not even disease. It was cold, a force so constant, so inescapable, that every society on Earth was shaped by a single, primal question. How do we stay warm when the world turns against us? We take warmth for granted now. A thermostat on the wall, a radiator humming beneath the window, a boiler fired by gas piped invisibly from beneath the earth. But for the vast majority of our history, warmth was not a utility. It was a daily negotiation with nature, fought with nothing more than fire, mud, animal breath, and human ingenuity. In medieval Europe, roughly between the 9th and 15th centuries, hundreds of millions of people lived, worked, slept, and died in structures that would horrify a modern building inspector. They had no insulation as we understand it, no central heating, no glass in most windows, no thermometer to measure just how cold it was getting. And yet they survived, generation after generation, through winters that could freeze rivers solid and bury villages under meters of snow. How they did it reveals something profound about the relationship between human beings and the built environment, a relationship we have almost entirely forgotten. To understand how medieval peasants heated their homes, we must first understand what those homes actually were. The popular imagination often portrays the medieval peasant dwelling as a quaint, timber-framed cottage with a thatched roof and a cheerful plume of smoke rising from a chimney. The reality was far more austere and far more ingenious than that storybook image suggests. The typical peasant house in England, France, or the German lands between the 10th and 13th centuries was a longhouse, a single-room structure roughly 6 to 10 meters long and 4 to 5 meters wide, built from whatever materials the local landscape provided. In forested regions, the frame was timber. In areas where wood was scarce, parts of Scotland, Ireland, Iceland, the steppe margins of Eastern Europe, walls were constructed from stone, turf, or cob, a dense mixture of clay, straw, and animal dung pressed into thick load-bearing walls. Roofs were almost universally thatched with straw, reed, or heather, layered sometimes 30 centimeters deep. These were not elegant structures, they were survival machines. And the single most important feature of every one of these homes was not the walls, not the roof, not the door. It was the fire. For centuries, the heart of the medieval peasant home was the open hearth, a shallow pit or a flat stone platform positioned directly in the center of the single main room. There was no chimney, there was no flue, there was no enclosed fireplace as we would recognize one. The fire burned on the ground in the middle of the living space, and the smoke rose, slowly, thickly, until it found its way out through a hole in the roof ridge, through gaps in the thatch, or simply hung in a permanent gray haze beneath the ceiling. This arrangement, primitive as it sounds, was not an oversight. It was a deliberate thermal strategy that had been refined over millennia, and it worked far better than a modern observer might expect. The open hearth was the defining technology of medieval domestic life, and everything in the peasant home was organized around it. The fire was never allowed to go out, not if it could be helped. Rekindling a fire from scratch, using a flint and steel striker against dried tinder, was a slow and uncertain process, especially in damp weather. A family that let its hearth die overnight faced a cold, miserable morning. In many communities, if your fire went out, you walked to a neighbor's house to borrow a live coal. The fire was treated less like a tool and more like a living thing that required constant tending. But the open hearth did more than simply produce heat through direct radiation. The fire heated the packed earth or clay floor beneath it, and that floor became a thermal mass, a reservoir of warmth that continued radiating heat long after the flames had died down to embers. The smoke, too, played a role that modern sensibilities find difficult to accept. As it rose and filled the upper portion of the room, it created a layer of warm, insulating air beneath the roof. The thatch above absorbed smoke oils over time, becoming increasingly waterproof and, to a degree, resistant to rot and insect infestation. Archaeological evidence from medieval sites across northern Europe shows thatch saturated with centuries of accumulated soot, black, dense, and remarkably well preserved. The smoke had another function. It preserved food. Meat, fish, and cheese hung from the rafters above the hearth were slowly and continuously smoked, maybe extending their edible life by weeks or even months. The medieval peasant home was not merely a shelter, it was a heating system, a food preservation facility, and a workshop, all contained within one smoke-filled room. The fire required fuel, and fuel was never free. For the medieval peasant, the question of what to burn was not a matter of preference. It was a matter of geography, law, and social hierarchy. In heavily forested regions, much of Central Europe, Scandinavia, all and the English Midlands before the Great Clearances, wood was the primary fuel. But even where forests were abundant, peasants rarely had unrestricted access to timber. Forests were controlled. In England after 1066, vast tracts of woodland were designated as royal forests, governed by brutal forest law. Cutting a living tree without permission could result in fines, imprisonment, or mutilation. Though peasants were typically permitted only to collect deadfall, branches and twigs that had already fallen to the ground, a right known as estover in English common law. The French equivalent was affouage. These were not generous grants. They were tightly regulated concessions that kept the peasant perpetually dependent on the goodwill of the lord. Where wood was scarce, people burned whatever the land offered. In Ireland, Scotland, the Netherlands, and across the boggy lowlands of northern Germany, the primary fuel was peat, dense, compressed plant matter cut from bogs in rectangular blocks, dried in the summer wind, and stacked for winter burning. Peat burns slowly, produces a steady low heat, and fills a room with a distinctive earthy smell that anyone who has visited a traditional Irish cottage would recognize. It was an effective fuel, but it was labor-intensive. A single family might need to cut, dry, and transport several thousand blocks of peat each year to survive the winter. In regions where neither wood nor peat was readily available, the open plains of Castile, parts of the Mediterranean basin, the dry grasslands of Eastern Europe, peasants turned to animal dung, cattle dung mixed with straw and dried in flat cakes against a south-facing wall burns surprisingly well. It produces less heat than wood, but more than might be expected. And its supply was limited only by the size of the household's herd. Dung fuel was not a sign of desperation. It was a rational, widespread practice used by millions of people across medieval Eurasia, and it remains in use today in parts of Central Asia and the Indian subcontinent. The medieval peasant could not control the weather, but the way a house was built could mean the difference between enduring a winter and dying in one. The most effective insulating material available to a medieval builder was mass. Thick walls retained heat. A cob wall, that mixture of clay, straw, and dung, could be 60 centimeters thick or more, and its thermal properties were remarkable. Cob absorbs heat during the day and releases it slowly at night, creating a natural temperature buffer that moderates the extremes of both summer and winter. Stone walls, common in upland regions, were less effective insulators on their own, but were often built as double-skin constructions, two parallel walls with a gap between them, packed with rubble, earth, or straw. This was, in principle, the same technology as a modern cavity wall. Roofs mattered enormously. A well-laid thatch roof, 30 centimeters deep, provided insulation comparable to several centimeters of modern fiberglass. Thatch traps air in the same way that feathers insulate a bird. Millions of tiny pockets of still air resist the transfer of heat. This is why medieval peasants did not want high ceilings. A low roof meant a smaller volume of air to heat, and a thicker blanket of warm, smoky air between the inhabitants and the frozen sky above. Windows were a problem. Glass was extraordinarily expensive throughout the medieval period, a luxury reserved for cathedrals, palaces, and the wealthiest merchants. Peasant homes either had no windows at all, or used small openings covered with oiled linen, scraped animal hide, or thin sheets of horn. These admitted a dim, diffused light while blocking most of the wind. In the coldest months, even these were often stuffed with rags or straw and sealed shut entirely. Darkness was the price of warmth. Most peasant families spent their winter evenings in near total darkness. They illuminated only by the glow of the hearth and perhaps a single rushlight, a dried reed dipped in animal fat. Doors were kept small and low, requiring anyone entering to duck, which minimized the volume of cold air that rushed in each time the door was opened. Many longhouses had an interior partition or a short entrance passage, a kind of primitive airlock that created a buffer zone between the outside and the living space. The peasants who built these homes did not understand thermodynamics, but they understood cold, and their solutions were empirically sound. Core Narrative Section 3: Animals, Bodies, and the Biology of Warmth. There is one feature of the medieval peasant longhouse that modern visitors would find most startling. In much of northern Europe, from the early medieval period well into the 15th century, the family livestock lived under the same roof as the family. And the classic longhouse was divided, often by nothing more than a low wattle fence or a slight change in floor level, into two zones. The family occupied one end. Their cattle, sheep, goats, and sometimes pigs occupied the other. The arrangement was not squalid negligence. It was calculated biology. A single adult cow produces roughly the same amount of heat as a 400-watt space heater, continuously, through metabolic processes alone. A household with 4 or 5 cattle had, in effect, make a 2,000-watt heating system that required no fuel beyond the grass and hay the animals would have eaten regardless. The animals' body heat, combined with the insulating mass of the walls and thatch, could raise the interior temperature of a longhouse by 5 to 10 degrees Celsius above the outside air, a margin that, on a night when temperatures plunged to minus 15 or 20, was the margin between life and death. The arrangement had costs. The smell was considerable. Then the air was thick with ammonia from animal urine. Parasites, fleas, lice, ticks moved freely between animals and humans. Respiratory diseases were endemic, aggravated by the constant inhalation of smoke, dust, and animal dander in an unventilated space. But the trade-off was accepted without question for centuries, because the alternative was colder and more dangerous. Human body heat itself was a resource. Medieval families slept together, parents, children, as sometimes grandparents, in a single bed or on straw-filled mattresses arranged close to the hearth. Shared body warmth under heavy woolen blankets or animal skins was not a matter of affection. It was thermal engineering at its most basic. The phrase "sleep tight" may have its origins in the roped bed frames of the period, where a tightly strung lattice of ropes supported the mattress. Whether or not that etymology is certain, I feel the practice of communal sleeping was universal across medieval Europe, and it was driven primarily by the need to conserve heat. For most of the medieval period, the open hearth reigned supreme, but slowly, beginning in the wealthiest households and gradually spreading downward through the social hierarchy, a technology emerged that would fundamentally transform the relationship between fire and shelter. The chimney. Chimneys were not a medieval invention. The Romans had used hypocaust systems, underfloor heating driven by furnaces, in their villas and bathhouses across Europe. But when the Roman infrastructure collapsed in the 5th and 6th centuries, that knowledge was effectively lost to Western European peasant life for the better part of a millennium. The chimney as we know it, a vertical stone or brick flue attached to an enclosed fireplace set into a wall, began appearing in the castles and manor houses of England and northern France in the 11th and 12th centuries. The great Norman keeps, such as those at Rochester and Colchester, were among the first secular buildings in post-Roman Europe to incorporate wall-mounted fireplaces with proper flues. The technology was expensive. It required cut stone or fired brick, skilled masonry, and careful engineering to ensure proper draft. For the peasant majority, the chimney remained an unattainable luxury until the late 14th and 15th centuries, when a combination of factors, rising peasant incomes after the Black Death, increased availability of brick, and a gradual cultural shift toward domestic privacy, began to make enclosed fireplaces and chimneys accessible to the middling classes. The chronicler William Harrison, writing in 1577 about the changes he had witnessed in his own lifetime in England, noted that elderly villagers marveled at 3 things that had transformed their world: the increase of chimneys, the replacement of straw pillows with feather ones, and the substitution of wooden platters with pewter. The chimney did more than remove smoke from the room. It restructured the entire social architecture of the home. With the open hearth gone from the center of the room, it became possible to divide the interior into separate spaces: a hall, a parlor, an upper story reached by a staircase. The single-room longhouse, which had defined peasant life for centuries, began to evolve into the multi-room house, Privacy, that most modern of comforts, was a direct consequence of the chimney. The ability to heat a room without filling it with smoke meant that rooms could be enclosed, and once rooms were enclosed, individuals could be separated from the communal mass. The chimney did not just change how people stayed warm, it changed how they lived. All of these strategies, the open hearth, the thick walls, the livestock cohabitation, the communal sleeping, had evolved during a period of relatively mild European climate. From roughly the 10th to the 13th centuries, the medieval warm period brought temperatures that were, on average, 1 to 2 degrees Celsius warmer than the centuries that followed. Vineyards flourished in southern England, as Norse settlers farmed the coasts of Greenland. Harvests were generous, and populations grew. Then the climate turned. Beginning in the late 13th century, and intensifying through the 14th, 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, Europe entered what climatologists call the Little Ice Age. Average temperatures dropped, winters became longer, harsher, and more unpredictable. The Thames froze solid enough to hold frost fairs, markets, games, and roasting oxen set up on the ice in the heart of London. The Baltic Sea froze so thoroughly that people walked from Denmark to Sweden. Alpine glaciers advanced, swallowing villages that had existed for generations. In the winter of 1407 to 1408, the cold across northern Europe was so severe that chroniclers in multiple countries recorded birds falling dead from the sky. For the peasant majority, the Little Ice Age was not an abstract climate event. It was a fuel crisis. Forests that had already been thinned by centuries of clearing for agriculture were now under even greater pressure. Demand for firewood surged at exactly the moment when growing seasons shortened and food supplies became precarious. In England, the price of firewood rose dramatically between the 14th and 16th centuries, pushing poorer households toward increasingly desperate alternatives: burning furniture, hedge cuttings, crop stubble, even dried seaweed in coastal communities. In parts of the Netherlands and northern Germany, peat extraction intensified so aggressively that it destabilized the landscape, creating the lakes and low-lying wetlands that define the Dutch countryside today. The Little Ice Age accelerated the transition to coal. In England, sea coal, so called because it was collected from exposed seams along the Northumberland coast and shipped south by sea, had been burned in small quantities since the 13th century. By the 16th century, as wood became scarce and expensive, coal burning spread rapidly through English towns and cities. London's famous smog, the choking, sulfurous fog that would define the city for centuries, had its origins not in the Industrial Revolution, but in the desperate search for affordable warmth during the coldest centuries of the last millennium. The story of medieval heating is, at its core, a story about trade-offs. Every solution carried a cost. The open hearth kept families alive, but filled their lungs with smoke. Cohabitation with livestock provided warmth, but spread disease. Thick walls and sealed windows preserved heat, but created darkness and stale air. Peat and dung burned reliably, but demanded enormous labor. The chimney brought comfort and privacy, but was available only to those who could afford it, deepening the divide between the propertied and the poor. What emerges from this history is not a picture of misery, though there was plenty of that, but a picture of adaptation. Medieval peasants were not passive victims of their environment. They were problem solvers operating within severe material constraints, and the solutions they devised were often remarkably effective. The thermal mass of a cob wall, the insulating properties of deep thatch, or the biological heating provided by livestock, these were not primitive approximations of modern technology. They were complete systems, evolved over generations, that kept millions of people alive through some of the harshest winters in European recorded history. We lost most of that knowledge. The industrialization of heating, first coal, then gas, then electricity, severed the ancient connection between human beings and the direct management of warmth. We no longer think about where our heat comes from, how it is produced, or what it costs the landscape. We turn a dial and the room warms. The medieval peasant, shivering beside a peat fire with cattle breathing in the darkness at the far end of the house, understood something we had forgotten. That warmth is not a right. It is a negotiation. Today, as energy prices climb and the climate conversation intensifies, or architects and engineers are rediscovering principles that a medieval builder would have found perfectly obvious. thermal mass, passive solar design, natural insulation, the strategic orientation of windows and walls. The peasant longhouse was not a relic of ignorance. It was a prototype, tested by centuries